Hello, everyone. I am Helen Miller. I'm a Deputy Director at the IFS, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our event this afternoon. How we reach net zero is clearly a huge challenge, and one where we need not just lots of policy action, but also lots of good ideas. And I've got no doubt that we're going to hear lots of good ideas today from our excellent panel of speakers. You're going to hear first from Isaac Delestre, who's an economist at the IFS. You'll then hear from Tim Lord, who leads the work on net zero for the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. And then last, but by absolutely no means least, you'll hear from Anna Valero, who is a senior policy fellow at the LSE Centre for Economic Performance, and who's done a large amount of work on innovation, including as it relates to climate change. So you'll hear from those three speakers who'll give you a good overview of what's happening in the UK and what the challenges are. We'll then have time for your questions. So if you do have questions, please put them into Slido, the link for which will be below the video, wherever you're watching the video. And if you like particular questions, please vote on them, because when I take questions, I'll basically pick the most popular ones to ask. So without further ado, let's kick off on today's event, and we'll start with Isaac. Isaac, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much, Helen. So I'm going to start off by talking a bit about the role of tax policy in achieving net zero. So the UK now has this legally binding target to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So I'm going to kick off by thinking a little bit about what progress the UK has made up until this point towards achieving that target. And then I'm going to think a little bit about tax policy in particular, and the role that that's playing in generating incentives or indeed disincentives to decarbonise in the UK. And then finally, I'm going to think a little bit about the challenges that are likely to face the UK in the coming decades. So first things first, what do we actually mean when we talk about net zero? So in the UK, the net zero target is measured against something called territorial emissions. So territorial emissions are basically the total greenhouse gas emissions generated on UK soil. So as you can see from this chart, territorial emissions have fallen quite a lot over the last 30 years, down almost 40% since 1990. And it is worth mentioning that by international standards, this is a pretty big reduction, right? So in fact, it's the largest reduction in territorial emissions of any G7 country. But territorial emissions isn't the only sensible way in which we can think about the UK's carbon footprint. So we could also look at a measure, for example, like consumption emissions. So consumption emissions are the measure of all greenhouse gas emissions associated with goods consumed here in the UK. And you can see that consumption emissions in the UK are quite a bit higher than territorial emissions, and they also haven't fallen by as much since 1990. And the reason they're higher is essentially that the UK is a net importer of goods which have greenhouse gas emissions embedded within them. So it's just worth noting here that if and when the UK does actually achieve net zero on this territorial emissions measure, it's likely that there will still be some positive consumption emissions associated with the UK. Okay, so one of the features of the reduction that the UK has seen in its emissions since 1990 is that reduction hasn't been particularly evenly shared across sectors. Some sectors have seen a much greater decarbonisation than others. So if we look at this chart here, the energy sector, which is largely electricity generation, the industrial sector, and also waste management have all seen pretty big reductions in emissions since 1990. Now, if you compare that to the household sector, that's mainly emissions from home heating and also the agricultural sector. These two sectors have seen much more modest reductions in emissions since 1990. And finally, if we look at transport, the top line here is land transport, which is predominantly road transport. We can see that land transport has not only not seen a reduction in emissions since 1990, it's actually seen a slight increase in emissions. And it's now the largest single source of emissions in the UK. Also, the bottom of these two lines, we can see air and shipping emissions. Those have actually increased quite substantially since 1990 by almost 40%. And that's largely as a result of big increases in emissions from international aviation. Although it is worth noting, this chart ends in 2018, and clearly there have been some pretty big reductions in international aviation emissions over the course of the pandemic. Okay, so we've got a broad idea of the progress the UK is making towards net zero. What I want to do now is move on to think a little bit about the role that policy, and particularly tax policy, is playing in shaping incentives for individuals and businesses to decarbonise. So the basic problem that climate change poses from an economic point of view is that individuals and businesses who generate greenhouse gas emissions don't face the full costs that those emissions impose on the rest of us in the form of climate change. Now, the textbook economic response to this kind of problem would be to impose a uniform cost on producing emissions. So you could do that, for example, by imposing a tax on every tonne of CO2 equivalent emissions generated. Crucially, by making sure that tax is uniform, so that making sure you charge the same amount of tax on a tonne of carbon dioxide, no matter who generates that carbon dioxide, what you achieve is that you avoid a situation where decarbonisation is occurring in one part of the economy when it could be occurring more cheaply or more efficiently in another part of the economy. So the uniformity of these kinds of taxes is going to be quite important in making sure that decarbonisation happens at the lowest possible cost to the economy as a whole. Now, it's very important to note that the UK is a long way from following this kind of textbook prescription of a uniform carbon price, a uniform carbon tax. Instead, the UK has quite a complex patchwork of different policies, all of which impact incentives to generate emissions in different ways. So there is an emissions trading scheme in the UK, which is probably the closest we come to having a true carbon price, but it only covers just under a third of total emissions generated in the UK. There's also a tax on energy consumption by businesses. There's a whole array of different levies and obligations on electricity suppliers, some of which are used to pay for subsidies for renewable electricity generation. There are taxes on individual emission sources like fuel, landfill and aviation. And if that wasn't complicated enough, all that is layered on top of a tax system which already favours certain forms of consumption over others. So just to give you some examples, if you think of VAT, there's a reduced rate of VAT on household energy bills, and there's actually also a zero rate of VAT on airline tickets. So we've got this quite complicated mess of different policies, all of which are affecting incentives in different ways for different kinds of people and different kinds of activities. What we'd really like to know is when you take all these policies together and add them all up, what overall incentives are they creating for different emissions generating activities? And so that's what we're doing here on this next chart, which is showing you for the energy sector, the implicit carbon tax that all these policies taken together generate on gas and on electricity. And we're looking at it for three different groups of end users. So we're looking at households, we're looking at energy intensive businesses, which benefit from certain carve-outs from environmental taxes. And we're also looking at non-energy intensive businesses. Now, the first thing just to notice here is that if the UK were following this textbook prescription of a uniform carbon price, all these bars would be the same size. Clearly, that's not the case. Clearly, the very complicated policy framework that the UK has adopted has led to some very, very different incentives being produced to decarbonise for different people in different parts of the economy. So if we just zoom in on a few of those, we can see that for electricity, well, if there is a tonne of carbon dioxide produced in generating electricity for the use of households, that tonne of carbon dioxide will be taxed at around £140. If the same tonne of carbon dioxide were produced generating electricity for the use of non-energy intensive businesses, on the other hand, that would be taxed at £230. So we have these kinds of inconsistencies across the economy, And the problem with those is that you're very likely to have a situation where there is decarbonisation taking place by non-energy intensive businesses that could be more efficiently or more cheaply undertaken by households. Equally, if you look across the board, and particularly at households, we can see that the carbon content of electricity is implicitly being taxed at quite at a much higher level than the carbon content of natural gas. So for households, there's a relatively high tax on the carbon content of electricity, but for the carbon content of natural gas consumed for, say, home heating, well, that actually is tax subsidised in the UK, mainly as a result of this 0% rate of VAT that applies to domestic energy bills. Now, taxes aren't the only options available to governments looking to disincentivise emissions. You can also subsidise greener alternatives, and that is something the government does. And so what I'm showing you on this chart are the average subsidies per megawatt hour of electricity produced for a whole range of different renewable electricity technologies. And what you can see is that the subsidy received by different technologies in the UK really differs by quite a lot. So the government's made an active decision to provide more generous support to technologies that are considered to be emerging, to be considered more infant, and to provide less support to more mature technologies. Now, that isn't necessarily a bad idea. There might be reasons why you might want a more diverse portfolio of renewable energy technologies, and you might want to foster innovation in various ways. But it is worth noting that the government has essentially tried to pick winners here. It's made certain bets, and if it's made the wrong bets, then it can turn out that these subsidies might end up costing the taxpayer more than they needed to. Okay, now finally, what I want to do is show you the implicit taxes in place in the transport sector. So we've already looked at the energy sector. I want to have a quick look at the transport sector. The yellow bar you're seeing here is the implicit tax on the carbon content of household electricity. We saw that in one of the previous charts. I've just put it here to give you a sense of scale. We can compare that to the implicit taxes on road transport. So petrol and diesel both have pretty high implicit carbon taxes associated with them as a result of fuel duties, which are levied still at a relatively high rate, despite real terms reductions over the last 10 years. And we can compare that with aviation. So the way in which aviation is taxed is a little bit more complicated than petrol and diesel. There's a 0% rate of VAT charged on airline tickets, as we already mentioned. It's also the case that airlines don't have to pay any fuel duty on the jet fuel they buy for their planes. Pushing in the other direction, however, there is a per passenger tax on airlines called the air passenger duty, and flights to the European Economic Area are also subject to the UK's emissions trading scheme. Now, how do all those things add up, and how does it all shake up in the end? Well, what you find is that an individual buying a flight from London to Paris ends up facing a pretty similar implicit tax on the carbon content of that flight as they do on the carbon content of their household electricity. However, if you look at a more expensive flight, so an individual, let's say, flying business class from London to New York, what you find is that those kinds of flights are actually associated with a pretty large tax subsidy. They're implicitly subsidised by the tax system. And the reason for that is that when you get to these more expensive flights, the value of that 0% rate of VAT gets bigger and bigger and ends up basically completely overwhelming any additional costs imposed by a passenger duty. So, I mean, the big picture here is that very much like in the energy sector, the current very complex nature of UK policy is creating really different incentives to generate emissions for different activities in different parts of the economy. Okay, so I want to now just finish off by thinking a little bit about the challenges the UK is likely to face in the coming decades. So I think it is worth just reiterating that the UK has actually made relatively good progress up until this point. It's made larger reductions in emissions than any G7 country since 1990. But there are still some very, very major challenges remaining. So the big picture here is that policy is currently incredibly complicated and frankly pretty confused. And I hope if you'll take anything from this talk, it's that one very powerful tool the government has at its disposal in trying to move the UK closer to net zero in the most efficient way possible would be to try and introduce a greater degree of consistency in how carbon is being priced across the economy and the kinds of costs that are being imposed on emitters in different parts of the economy. Now, doing that wouldn't be without its challenges. So one big challenge associated with doing that are international issues. So one of the reasons why one of the reasons why lower carbon taxes tend to be levied on energy-intensive businesses, for example, is the government's worried that those businesses might face a great deal of international competition. For instance, if taxes are too high in the UK and those businesses choose to move overseas, well, that's going to be bad for UK competitiveness, obviously, but it's also not going to help us with climate change because those businesses are going to keep producing emissions overseas rather than in the UK. So we would like to avoid that happening. One option the UK might have would be to pursue something like a carbon border tax in order to protect the competitiveness of UK industry. But achieving that realistically is probably going to require some kind of international consensus or agreement, at least if the UK wants to avoid sparking some kind of trade war. There are also pretty important inequality concerns. So it's really worth noting that £1 spent by the lowest income households in the UK is associated with about 20% more emissions than £1 spent by the highest income households in the UK. The reason that's important is that if you did impose a genuinely uniform carbon tax in the UK, it would end up hitting lower income households harder than higher income households. And so if the UK does want to move in this direction to have more uniform carbon pricing, it's almost certainly going to be the case that the UK might want to look at the possibility of potentially compensating these lower income households, maybe using some of the revenue raised by these carbon taxes. So that's going to be all from me. I think I'm now going to pass you over to Tim, who's going to talk in a little bit more depth about the way in which we can use tax to achieve carbon reductions.
Yeah, thanks, Isaac, and hi everyone. Very happy to be here. So, the angle that I was going to take to talk about this is thinking about net zero tax, and in particular, behaviour changes that we need to go through to deliver net zero. So first, I want to talk a little bit about the behaviour changes that we're going to have to make in order to achieve the net zero target. If you look at the government analysis and the climate change committee analysis. Secondly, what the key things we need to think about in terms of the tax system are in that context, and then thirdly, try and draw some tentative conclusions. So if we start with what we actually have to do to deliver net zero from a behaviour change perspective, the first thing to say is that behaviour change is absolutely essential to delivering net zero. So if we look at the last 10 years, and Isaac talked a little bit about this, most of the emission savings we've made have been through the power sector. And we've done a great job in doing that, but it hasn't required any behaviour change. You still flick the light switch and the lights come on. So about 87% of our emission savings have come basically from technology change, from fuel switching from fossil fuels to low carbon fuels, only 13% from behaviour change. Now, if you look ahead and use the climate change committee numbers, which are pretty similar to the government numbers, that proportion rises from 13% to 59%. In the next 15 years, as we move to the government's 2035 target for emission reductions of 78% against 1990 levels. And the emission savings requiring no behaviour change, so the stuff that just kind of happens behind the scenes without consumers really noticing, falls from 87% to 41%. So while behaviour change isn't the only game in town, it's a hugely important part of how we achieve emission reductions. But it's worth saying as well that sometimes what we hear is that net zero requires us all to stop flying. You can't have a car anymore. You can't eat meat anymore. You're going to freeze under your blankets, as a particularly florid Telegraph column put it recently. But in fact, there's only a relatively small number of behaviour changes that really matter in this context. So very briefly, there's 6 of them, and we outlined these in a report a month or two ago. So the first is about our homes, so moving from high carbon gas to lower carbon alternatives, in particular through electrification of heating. Secondly, we need a lot of EVs on the road, so rising to about 10 million by the end of this decade, but to about 25 million by 2035. That's out of about 40 million cars on the roads altogether. We need to drive a bit less, according to the CCC, so about 4% lower kilometres per person. We need to recycle more, we need to consume a bit less, and we need to overall reduce the amount of waste that we're producing. We need to eat a little bit less meat and dairy, so down kind of 20 to 30%, depending which number you use, although the government have said that they're not advocating for that reduction, and they're going to try and find the emission savings elsewhere. And we need to fly a bit less, so about 6% fewer kilometres per person. So it's just to emphasise, there are really significant behaviour change requirements, but the number is relatively limited. So what does that mean for the tax system? Well, I would draw out 5 key implications that we need to be thinking pretty hard about. So the first is about structural changes. So the classic example of this is the loss of fuel duty revenues. Now, I disagree with Isaac ever so slightly in that I don't think petrol and diesel duty is purely a carbon price, in the sense that it does a lot of things, including reducing congestion or aiming to reduce congestion. But the bottom line is that no matter which way you look at it, currently EVs pay about 98% less tax than petrol and diesel vehicles. And what that means is if we don't do anything, we're going to lose about 10 billion of tax revenue by 2030. We're going to lose more like 30 billion by 2040. And over that period, the cumulative loss to the exchequer is about well over 240 billion pounds, which is a lot of money no matter which way you look at it. So the first thing we're going to need to do is actually accept that there are some big structural changes happening in our tax system as a result of the move to net zero, and planning to address them. Because what we can't do is kind of wait till 2030 and then go, oh dear, we've lost a lot of revenue, we're going to lose a lot more. Now we're going to impose an alternative, for example, road pricing, because at that point people will quite legitimately say, hang on a minute, I bought my EV on the assumption that it's going to be very cheap to run, and now you're moving the goalposts. So that's the first thing, is address the structural changes. The second thing about tax is about how do we meet the costs of this transition. And this chart is from the CCC and their advice on the 6th carbon budget, and you may have seen it before, but above the line, it has the costs that the CCC estimate are involved in the transition. So these rise quite quickly through the 2020s and stay at a level between kind of 40 and just under 60 billion pounds out to 2050. And under the line, you've got the savings that occur as a result of the transition, in particular through savings on, for example, comparative cost of fuel for cars. Now, the key thing that's notable about this is that the costs happen quite early and the savings come a lot later. So there's a real question about how we use the tax system to meet those costs, or how we use alternatives in terms of paying for them up front, versus how we use borrowing to meet them, either private sector or public sector borrowing. And what the Treasury have said in their net zero cost review is that they don't want to use additional borrowing to fund net zero. I think my view would be that implicitly then means we're going to have to use tax to do it, even though the costs are high up front, but the benefits, both in terms of savings, but also in terms of hopefully reducing the level of climate change, and therefore the implications of that come much later. So that is something that I think there's going to be quite a lot of debate about, and we're going to need to think pretty hard about, is how much we use the tax system versus other means of raising revenue to pay the upfront costs. The third area to look at is behavioural incentives. I won't linger on this because Isaac's touched on it in his presentation. But if we look at what we need to do on heating, basically we need to get people off gas and onto electricity or other low carbon forms of heating. But as Isaac said, these numbers are slightly different. Actually, these are the Treasury numbers, and we'll have to unpick precisely why the Treasury numbers are a bit different to the IFS. You can choose who you trust more. But the key thing is not the number itself, but the difference, where electricity faces a very high carbon price and a rising carbon price as it decarbonises. But the policy costs for that decarbonisation all fall onto the lowest carbon form of energy, which is electricity, versus gas, where you pay virtually no carbon price at all. And what that translates into is that the running costs of electric forms of heating, like heat pumps, are a lot higher than the running costs of gas. And the incentive that creates is pretty obvious. It's that I should keep my boiler because it's cheaper to buy and cheaper to run. But we need 600,000 heat pumps a year by 2028. We need 1 million-ish by 2030. We need 1.5 million by 2035. So not just in heating, but in other areas of the economy, we need to think about the incentives that we're creating in the tax system and address them. And obviously that links to some of the things that Isaac was talking about the consistency of carbon pricing, not just here, but in other parts of the economy too. The fourth area that I think is really important is around signalling. So you'll no doubt have seen the announcement that the Chancellor made in the budget a week or two ago to cut air passenger duty for domestic flights. Now, there was a lot of talk that was going to increase emissions. I think some excellent IFS analysis showed that actually wouldn't necessarily increase emissions. That's because domestic flights are part of the emissions trading system. So if they emit more, then someone else emits less, all other things being equal. But I think the crucial thing here is to think about the signal that that sends. So domestic flights are a high carbon activity. There's a relatively low carbon price, certainly in comparison to some other things, and they have much lower carbon alternatives. So driving is significantly lower carbon, the train even more so. So the signal that that sends to consumers is a pretty confusing one about what do you actually want me to do in this context. And we see that more broadly in some of the stuff that Isaac talked about the inconsistency of carbon pricing across the economy. The signal that we are sending to consumers is a very confusing one. And then the last one, which is obviously of critical importance, is around fairness. So the example I've used here is fuel expenditure, of which the carbon price or tax is a really significant share on petrol for driving cars. And you can see that the lowest income decile spend, when they own a car, spend roughly 12% of their income on fueling it, versus the 10th income decile, which pays more like 2%. And I think there's a couple of things you can draw from this. One is that there's quite a lot of unfairness embedded in the tax system around these kinds of issues at the moment, and actually a transition to a different kind of taxation system into taxing carbon in a different way can aid fairness overall and actually help to address some of that. I think that the second one is that we have to see this set of issues in the round. There's a risk, I think, sometimes in the way we talk about net zero, that we think that every single component of the tax changes and the fiscal changes that it might involve has to be fair in and of itself. When actually, I think what we need to do, given the scale of the transition that we're talking about, is look at it in the round and think about the tax system as a whole and the extent to which that is fair. Because there may be some parts of this which do bear more heavily on poorer households, but they are then compensated in other ways. So just to draw some quick conclusions as I run out of time, so I'll run through these quickly. The first is that net zero does not have to be a high tax agenda. And I think there's actually a political opportunity there because there is a perception that it does have to be. But when we look at the costs and the benefits relationship, for example, there is scope for rebalancing the tax system as opposed to just adding additional costs. Because, for example, when there's newspaper articles about road pricing, there tends to be an assumption that road pricing will be on top of what people already pay, when in practice, of course, it can be a replacement for it, and it can be designed to be fairer than the existing system. The second is tax is only one of a suite of options, and it isn't necessarily the right lever to pull. I agree that the economic ideal is a single carbon price, but I think in practical terms, that isn't necessarily the right way to go. And we have to think about tax alongside other incentives like regulation and government support, etc. The third is that cost does not equal tax. And there's again, sometimes an assumption that the two are the same thing, but obviously very different. The fourth is that fairness matters. And in that context, I just highlight the point that Isaac made, which is, the kind of polluter pays sounds good and often is the right thing to do, but in some cases the polluter might be someone who doesn't have the capital, for example, to invest in energy efficiency in their home or whatever, and therefore has a limited ability to act. So we need to make sure we're building fairness in there. And then the last is that communication is absolutely key. When you look at any of the public polling around this, people are very, very concerned and cautious around changes to taxation to deliver environmental outcomes. So the way that this is designed, but equally importantly, the way that this is communicated is going to be hugely important to the success of the agenda as a whole. So I shall stop there and hand over to Anna for the third presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm really happy to take part in this discussion today. And I think a lot of the messages that I'll be highlighting here are very consistent with what we've heard before. So the angle I'm going to focus on is really the story about innovation and growth and the transition to net zero emissions and what all this implies in terms of policies, in terms of taxes, but also other policy levers. And in doing so, I'll be drawing on an article I wrote with Nicholas Stern, which was published in Research Policy, and a series of reports on sustainable growth that I've written with CP and Grantham Research Institute colleagues, and also more recent work on the Resolution Foundation CP Economy 2030 inquiry. So just to take stock on why this is such a challenge right now, this is really a decisive decade. We've got net zero, we've got a series of pre-existing fragilities, and we've got COVID recovery to contend with. So on climate change, I think by now we all know the immense scale of the challenge. We know there are immense dangers of warming beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade. Time is running out if we're able to keep that target alive. Pre-COP, we saw we're actually on a course to 2.7 degrees centigrade. Recent IA analysis being more positive if all of the current promises were implemented. But this is the crucial thing, we need that implementation, and we also should be focusing for 1.5. So targets are one thing, but moving into action is the key challenge now. And all of this is against the background of what we saw in the decade pre-COVID. We saw rising emissions, destruction of biodiversity, falling investment rates and slowing growth in many advanced economies. In the UK in particular, the productivity puzzle has been particularly acute in the UK. This has widened our pre-existing gaps with our core comparator countries in terms of productivity. And of course, there have been challenges around social cohesion and populism with a faltering of internationalism in many cases. And then there's the COVID shock with the tragic loss of life, the human cost, the economic impacts, and widening of pre-existing inequalities. All of this has really underlined some of the dangers, weaknesses, and fragilities in our world economy. So against this background, we argue that a new approach to growth is urgently required, rather than thinking about the environment and decarbonisation as a separate issue from economic growth and productivity. These things need to be joined together. So a new model for sustainable, inclusive and resilient growth, which would be driven by clean investments and innovations. So over the short to medium to 5 to 10 year time horizon, this will really involve investment in sustainable infrastructure and other complementary assets that we know can boost shorter run demand and growth, sharpen supply, improve efficiency, with a series of co-benefits that go along with that, benefits to health from cleaner air, for example. Over about 10 years, we'll see that this should spur further innovation. We already have a lot of great innovations, which we know we can use, but we need more innovation. Today is actually the Science and Innovation Day at COP26, so it's timely to be discussing this here. So that will then unleash new ways of innovation and discovery, and for advanced economies like the UK, growth opportunities. We have sources of comparative advantage which we can leverage as global markets are growing. And over 20 years or further, there is no other kind of growth on offer. Low carbon is the only feasible longer run growth. Anything else would self-destruct. In terms of current analyses, it's looking like low carbon technologies and business models could be competitive in sectors representing over 70% of global emissions. Of course, all of this requires substantial investment across types of capital. In the UK, we have very clear kind of projections of what types of investments and costs are required. But we argue these can generate higher returns in a more resilient economic model. As Tim said, change will be felt by citizens and consumers in this next wave, whereas before we generally didn't actually have to change our behaviours to achieve the change. And of course, now we're seeing that momentum in policy is building. There's momentum in terms of consumer attitudes, citizens' attitudes, the actions of businesses and investors. So this all has to be leveraged now to be able to make the changes we need. There are a series of market failures that point to a collection of policies. And of course, the most commonly discussed one is the one that Isaac focused on, the greenhouse gas externality, which obviously points towards taxes, to try particularly a coordinated and robust carbon price that would align incentives, also cap and trade and regulation type of levers to address it. But other types of market failure at play here too, some of which, like the greenhouse gases externality, is specific to the environment, and I would argue also the co-benefit story is too, in the sense that decarbonisation carries with it a number of co-benefits which the markets don't necessarily price in, so those benefits are not priced in to market outcomes. But then there are other kind of market failures that relate to innovation, which we might argue are enhanced in the case of clean technologies. So the well-known R&D externality. The individual private sector firm doesn't necessarily internalize all the benefits of the R&D and the innovations that it creates. So this just justifies public support for R&D and tax incentives. And here, evidence from colleagues at the LSE has shown that knowledge spillovers are actually tending to be greater for clean technologies than their dirty counterparts. There are capital market imperfections, which means that perhaps certain areas of investment are seen as more risky than others, and there's evidence that this has been the case in clean tech in recent years. There are, of course, network issues, whereby you need government action to invest in coordinated infrastructure assets, planning, system design. Information frictions, as has been discussed, raising awareness amongst the consumer or businesses and their supply chain decisions, investors in their decisions of where to put their money, and of course workers in terms of what skills to invest in for future-proof and resilient jobs. And of course, some markets are absent. So in this case, when we don't know the actual solutions to a problem, that's where investor expectations and credible pathways become so crucial. But even if we had a series of policies to address each of these individual market failures, we really need this collected and coordinated set of policies to create that consistency, which the other speakers have highlighted that we need in terms of driving behavior change and all the actions required across the economy. And you can think about this a bit in terms of path dependencies. We need to make change very quickly, and it's radical change. And in order to do that, we need coordinated policies, incentives, and institutions. Path dependencies in production, deployment, and the diffusion of new technologies mean that you can't necessarily get the change at the pace required without having that. And this concept is captured in the literature on the environment and directed technical change, which has shown that if you don't have policy, the market forces would favor the kind of incumbent dirty sector. Sound policy involves both carbon taxes and other levers, including subsidies to R&D and regulation, for example. But once clean technologies have gained their productivity advantage and are able to benefit from their own path dependencies, the idea is you don't then need further policy at that point. This literature has also been extended to consider the importance of pro-environmental attitudes. So we know that behavior and attitudes are crucial for meeting net zero, but this literature has shown that they also shape the innovation outcomes of firms, particularly in more competitive markets. So when we think about public attitudes and change and the need for this new economic strategy, it's really important to take this holistic view. And while we've seen that pro-environmental attitudes have been rising in recent years, the real challenge here is to convert that into action. There are many barriers, which I think have been discussed, but while prices are relatively high in some areas of technology, maybe with the best willing in the world, you can't necessarily afford to buy that new cleaner piece of technology. There are disruptions to people's day-to-day lives, for example, in installing a new heat pump at home. There are issues of free riding. If other people are doing it, do I need to do it? Information in terms of what's actually the best option, infrastructure to enable you to, for example, charge your electric vehicle, and distributional aspects. And this is the type of subject that we covered in some depth in our Economy 2030 inquiry carbon crunch paper. And here there's just an example of those distributional aspects. Basically, we know that there are savings to do with having an electric vehicle, but it's likely that some of those savings would be more likely to flow to the better off households who, for example, are more likely to have a garage or off-street parking and therefore can benefit from cheaper charging. So in the Economy 2030 inquiry, we really characterize this next stage in the UK's journey to net zero as being one that involves more visible change, as we've discussed, in terms of behavior change in transport, homes, diet, jobs as well. It requires fair management of costs and sharing of benefits, and that's crucial for actually achieving and maintaining support. And all of this requires an update of our economic strategy to reflect the change context. And this is really the argument for we've had poor growth. We need to actually bring all of this together in a new economic strategy, acknowledging, for example, the changes in the tax base over time and preempting that. So what we're doing in this Economy 2030 inquiry is building evidence that can help shape this. Talking a little bit more about these sustainable growth opportunities, which I've mentioned. We've seen already that there's been very rapid falls in the costs of renewable technologies. You can see that on the right-hand side here. So for example, 82% fall in solar technologies over 2010 to 2019. And what's actually happened is many of these prices have fallen faster than was expected at the time. And all of this has happened despite fairly weak policies and commitment. This suggests that with much more commitment, as we're seeing now, there's potential for much faster change. but how can specific countries or regions determine which types of technology, goods or services to support as part of an innovation or industrial policy to actually leverage some of these sustainable growth opportunities that I've mentioned? One way of doing this in terms of forward-looking empirical analysis is using patents data. And this is something we've done at the LSE, both looking economy-wide, but also in some deep dives in terms of the electric vehicles market and also carbon capture, usage and storage technologies. And what these charts here show is that actually the UK has technological advantage in terms of its patenting activity versus the rest of the world in a number of clean technologies, in particular ocean energy and wind energy. And these were areas that some of the previous charts showed actually received quite high subsidies. So that suggests that's a good policy. But one thing is to have advantage and be quite good at patenting something. The other thing is, does it actually generate spillovers and economic returns in your own country? And the right-hand chart shows actually there's some suggestion that wind energy and ocean energy has some positive returns in the UK. Now, what we did in this paper as well, we were considering how well placed is the UK research system for addressing these key societal challenges. So climate change being one of them, the other one was COVID. And we looked at kind of our strengths in terms of COVID related technology like vaccine development. It's no surprise that we're good at those things too. But then what we did was we looked at the geographical distribution of some of our strengths here. And this links to the levelling up agenda and trying to even out economic performance across the country. So what we found was that patenting in clean technologies appears to be relatively spread across the country, as compared to when you look at all technologies, which is the chart on the left-hand side, or simply the COVID-related ones. Those tend to be more concentrated around the so-called golden triangle, whereas you'll see on the right-hand side, clean patents are quite spread across the country. So we argue that there's a triple win here, whereby support for clean technologies can actually help mitigate climate change because the UK is good at finding those global solutions for this issue, good at promoting economic growth in the UK, the spillovers and economic returns to some of these technologies are high in the UK, but also potentially good for levelling up as well, given the geographic distribution of activity. Now, of course, patenting is one way of looking at this. Not all innovation is patented. So we're also doing a lot of work with trade data and with other new kind of forms of assessing companies' activities, for example, using their websites and corporate communications. But what we kind of bring this together into thinking about is a kind of framework of how policies can be thought of in terms of generating and crowding in investment in these 5 complementary types of capital. So infrastructure and physical capital, knowledge capital and innovation, human capital, natural capital, and social capital. And many of these levers are at the national level, as we've discussed, carbon pricing, having something that's robust and consistent in terms of the incentives it's producing. Regulation and standards, procurement, R&D subsidies, major infrastructure decisions, and of course, national growth and skills policies. These are all generally taken at the national level. But across all of these areas, the local regional level is also key to implementing climate action. And I put some examples here, probably don't have time to discuss them all. But just taking one example, when we're thinking about knowledge innovation, there are place-based aspects to this in terms of support for emerging technologies, coordination of projects, strengthening linkages between stakeholders, for example, universities and businesses at the local level. So in conclusion, the argument is that sustainability can be achieved by reorienting growth rather than slowing or stopping it. And this is not a new idea. Chris Freeman, the economist and innovation scholar and co-authors, they kind of had this in a publication in 1973. This was clearly a long time ago, but it feels like a lot of progress is being made now in terms of intentions and targets, but we really need to actually convert this now into action. And to do so, we need coordinated government policy with consistent, long-term and credible types of policies and incentives. We need to build support from consumers and civil society, which will be required not only for achieving net zero, but also for crowding in that investment that we need to benefit from the economic opportunities associated with it. And we need to act at scale and pace. Policy action and real-time research are required at the same time. We don't necessarily know all the answers when such radical changes need to be made. And in that sense, policies might need to be updated as new findings emerge or as circumstances change. Thank you very, very much. Back to you, Helen.
Great, thank you everyone. That was lots of food for thought. So we have a whole bunch of questions on slides. Let me just jump straight into the questions and get through as many as we can in our remaining 15 minutes. So there's a couple of clarification questions. So let's start with those just to get everyone on the same page. So I'll ask these to you in the first instance, Isaac. So one is just, what do we mean by an implicit carbon tax? You can iron that out for us. And why is it that £1 spent by the poorest households is associated with more carbon? Why is it more carbon intense? So Isaac, do you want to just deal with those two?
Yeah, so the implicit carbon tax, I've been confused people with that language. It's basically just that most of these taxes aren't real carbon taxes and they don't tax the actual carbon content of something. So we're just saying, okay, in terms of the total amount of carbon it produces, what's the tax associated with that amount of carbon? It might be that the carbon would increase in that particular good or service or whatever it may be, and the tax wouldn't necessarily increase. So it's an implicit carbon tax, and that most UK carbon taxes aren't carbon tax in the true sense. In terms of why is it that £1 spent by the poorest household is associated with more emissions than £1 spent by the richest households? That's largely to do with the fact that quite carbon intensive things make up a bigger portion of poorer household spending. So the most obvious example is to think about something like energy bills. They tend to make up a much bigger share of household spending for poorer households than they do for richer households, and those things are quite carbon intensive. Although it's worth noting that while the spending of poorer households is more carbon intensive in the sense that each pound is associated with more emissions, total emissions associated with the household, with the spending of richer households is obviously much higher, because richer households just spend more pounds. So you can, if each pound is associated with less emissions, the total emissions associated with their spending is going to be higher.
Great, thank you. So let's take our top question, which I'm going to ask to all of you, but I'll broaden out a little bit. So the question is, what sort of compensation packages would you suggest to ensure that the poorest aren't hardest hit by carbon taxes? Let me broaden that out to say, how should we think more broadly about when we're designing policies, when to take into account distributive issues? I think, like Tim was saying, we don't need all of it to be redistributive, but when do you make decisions about having taxpayers pay versus bill payers? So how do we manage all of these distributional issues in the round? Tim, let me come to you first. I know you touched on that.
Sure, yeah, just a couple of quick thoughts on that. So the first is about, we think about home heating, for example. If we rebalance the cost between electricity and gas bills, that'll incentivize people to get heat pumps, but people on lower incomes will have less ability to buy those. So for example, if we recycle carbon tax revenues to support them to be able to make those capital investments, that's one way that you can do them. There's obviously a variety of different tunes that you can play on that kind of approach. The second thing I'd say is the point I made about fairness in the kind of tax benefit system overall. So if we look, for example, at the fact that we're currently dealing with an energy crisis and the prices have risen significantly, now consumers are protected from that to a degree because of the price cap, but we can already see that next April those prices are going to go up a lot. Now, one way you can compensate for that is, for example, by giving people money off their energy bills. But another way you might compensate for that is, on universal credit or in the benefit system more generally, or in other ways. And I think the key thing that I would say is that from a net zero perspective, it's really important that we think about fairness as we design policies, but not that every single thing that we do on net zero has in itself to be distributionally perfectly fair. We have to look across the whole system and make sure that it's fair as a whole.
Great, thank you, Tim. Anna, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. I think areas of targeted support where we know that, for example, some investment is required, which there are financial constraints that prevent some groups from doing that. That seems like a really good way to use some of those carbon tax revenues. And then, as Tim said, it's about a holistic view. I think when people feel like a program of change is fair, that's more likely to kind of generate support for it. And people won't necessarily be looking at every intricate policy to see if that is individually fair. But overall, there has to be a program for addressing long-standing inequalities in the UK. And that has to be also including education, skills, future jobs, having perhaps more investment in groups that have been left behind in terms of having a better future that is perhaps linked to this net zero transition, I think is another kind of positive way to create fairness and also improve people's understanding and support for this large scale change.
Great, thanks. Isaac?
Yes, I mean, I do agree with quite a lot of that. I think one thing also just to bear in mind, and one of the things that makes this quite difficult, is that there are quite a few different dimensions of fairness which we can think about when we're talking about reducing emissions. So I mean, we've thought a lot about this aspect of people at the bottom of the income distribution might pay a higher price if you had this kind of uniform carbon pricing policy. But there are also all kinds of horizontal dimensions in which some people might be worse off than others. So you might happen to have a house that's very hard to heat. You might live in an area of the country where the housing stock tends to be more difficult to insulate. And so there are real questions to think about as to do we want to compensate people because of the kind of house they tend to live in, and because of the part of the country they choose to live in. There's no straightforward answer to those questions. I think those are difficult topics to tackle. But I do think it's just worth bearing in mind that the inequality isn't only in terms of up and down the income distribution. There's all kinds of people who may have similar incomes, but who may face very, very different costs in terms of decarbonisation. And it's just worth thinking about the ways in which the system ends up addressing that and ends up dealing with those kinds of inequalities as well.
Great, thanks everyone. So there's a group of questions here about new taxes. I'm going to take them all together, and again, I'll ask you all of you for your views on this. So there's one question about, would a higher wealth tax be better than a carbon tax for changing behaviour? Do we need taxes on air pollution, so not just the emissions, but the particulates, I guess? And a question about, what is your opinion on a carbon tax in agriculture? So feel free to take any of those. I think the broader question here is, there are some areas where we don't tax anything at all. Like agriculture, there are very few incentives to change behaviour. And while we have high taxes in some areas, we have basically no taxes in other areas. So I guess the broad question for you all is, if you're going to do something in one area, what's the big missing tax, or the big area where we think we need to do something and where tax is the right lever? What's the big thing we need to do next? Anna, I'll start with you.
I think that, it does link to behaviour change, and I think that's where taxes are important, where, as we've seen, that we don't have the coordinated incentives to actually enable individuals to make the decisions that will minimise their carbon emissions, even when people actually want to. And I think air travel is a good example of that. At a time when France, for example, is closing down a number of domestic air routes, we are encouraging people to travel domestically by air. And of course, in the round, that policy itself might not increase emissions, but it is about the signalling. And if people think, well, it's fine to travel by air domestically, then they're also likely to not necessarily limit their international travel and bring that down, as we know we need to. So I think it really has to be about having clear incentives to enable that behaviour change, which we don't have yet.
Great, Isaac.
Yes, trying to take those two questions separately. On pollution, absolutely. I think that the same principles apply to pollution as apply to carbon emissions in many ways, right? In many cases, you've got individuals or businesses producing pollutants, and they're not facing the full cost of those pollutants. And it would be completely sensible to tax those pollutants in the same way you might want to tax carbon. I don't think that's mutually exclusive. In terms of agriculture, clearly, if you want to impose uniform incentives to move away from carbon-intensive activities, the production of beef, for example, is very, very carbon-intensive. I think one of the things you need to be a little bit cautious with in terms of agriculture, in particular, this is an issue for many different industries, is that you do want to avoid a situation where, for instance, we eat less beef produced in the UK, but eat more beef that's imported from, say, Brazil, where maybe rainforest has been cut down to produce more land for that farming. So as long as imposing a tax on agriculture does genuinely mean the overall global amount of agriculture is reducing, then it does seem just as sensible as taxing any other kind of carbon emission. I think is broadly what I'd say, but you have to be cognizant of those kind of potential international carbon leakage issues.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, so I think two thoughts. First, on the question of kind of taxing other pollutants. I think the key thing there is that different taxes can do more than one thing, right? And fuel duty is a great example of that. Fuel duty is a carbon price. It is an air pollution tax. It is a congestion tax. It is a pure, frankly, revenue raiser. for the Treasury. And you can argue it's, you know, all those things, none of those things, a combination of those things. And similarly for other taxes, you know, one of the things that we need to think about is how do you tick a number of different boxes in the approach that you take, and as a bare minimum, how do you avoid, for example, increasing air pollution while you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions and so on, which some technologies and approaches can do. I think in terms of the kind of wish list or you know, where are the big gaps, I think I'd highlight two. One we've already talked about, which is on gas and electricity, where although it's not a tax, it's in effect an implicit tax in terms of the way that we focus policy costs on electricity, not gas, and therefore create a disincentive to use the lowest carbon fuel. The other one is agriculture and land use. And I broaden that out slightly from just kind of how do you get agricultural emissions down. There's a much bigger question around land use and its role in decarbonisation. So not just about cutting emissions, but growing biomass, afforestation, etc. And tax can definitely play a role, although I don't think it solves the whole problem in terms of how you shift those incentives so that owners of land, not just farmers, but obviously farmers to a large degree, are using that land in a way that not only cuts emissions, but also supports the wider decarbonisation of the economy.
Great. And can I pick up on that, Tim, on this point about, I mean, partly I was excited the point about carbon leakage, which I think is a concern actually across a number of areas. Like, yeah, it's why we have these high energy intensive businesses getting lower carbon prices. To what extent do you think that the challenge in, say, agriculture is that we just have to find international agreement on taxes so that we can put up our taxes without things going offshore? Or are we going to need to rely more heavily on basically getting consumers to change their consumption patterns and just choose to eat less meat, for example? I mean, does the international issue there and the current lack of international coordination seemingly on border taxes and things like that mean that we're going to have to rely more on getting individuals to just change what they're doing? What do you think about that?
I mean, I think, you know, this is a bit of a cop-out, but I think you kind of need to do a bit of both. If you look at carbon border adjustments, I think they are really hard to do. And if you look at how hard it was to achieve the agreement on corporation tax, and then, you know, how much sort of different countries have tried to wriggle out of elements of that kind of demonstrates that. Having said that, carbon border adjustment taxes were, you know, purely theoretical really 2 or 3 years ago, whereas now they are genuinely on the agenda. The EU is looking at it hard, you know, the UK government increasingly as well. So I think they can potentially have quite an important role. But I think you do need, you know, a degree of behaviour change as well, and you need to have some incentives in your tax system, and a country like the UK has to show some leadership around that also.
Great. So we're coming up against time. Let me ask one last question again to all of you, and I'll start with Isaac. And one issue that's come up, I think, in everything all of you have said is that, you know, in going forward, the incentives now have been tilted much more in a way that people are going to notice it. It won't be quietly behind the scenes in electricity getting cleaner. It'll be partly there, but it'll partly be in households needing to do things differently. How do we get people on board with this change so that when it comes, both it's not a shock, but also they see it as a positive thing for the reasons that Anna was setting out, as opposed to something to be resisted? So what do we do to make sure that people come with the agenda? Isaac?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think in many ways, you know, the potentially a reason to be slightly more pessimistic about the future is just that in some ways we have taken the low-hanging fruit in terms of decarbonisation, as we've sort of all discussed. Some of the stuff that's happened so far in terms of big reductions in emissions from moving to coal generation to gas generation and partially to renewable generation aren't things that people really notice. And if we want to make more gains, we are going to have to start cutting into things which people are going to notice much more. I mean, you know, how you make that appealing to people. I think, you know, in reality, if we are going to reach net zero with the technology we currently have, maybe there will be some great technological innovation which will save us some of the pain in the future. But looking at the current rate of technological progress, I think the reality is we are going to have to accept that there is going to be some level of reduced consumption for people in some of these areas if we're going to achieve net zero.
Anna?
Yeah, I would say there's 3 things. I mean, one, innovation really is key in this story. So if we're talking about, we've seen those cost curves. If the prices of key technologies come down due to innovation, which we can presumably achieve now with much more money going into this and a lot more will as well, then that can really help overcome some of the resistance to change based on at least cost or perceived cost. But I think really crucial is realizing, well, first of all, understanding and realizing the benefits, both economic and wider health co-benefits, for example. For example, if we through taxing fuel or through having clean air zones or congestion charging, that's good for the environment. It's also very good for health. And, you know, air pollution is actually a very big killer in the UK and internationally. So realizing and communicating those benefits as being actually part of a more healthy and improved life for people is really key. But then also, I think being upfront about some of the costs, and, you know, as we've discussed, where there are distributional elements to that, making sure that they can be preemptively managed in a fair way. That's kind of key to achieving that support.
Thanks. Tim, final word to you.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. So I think three things very briefly. So the first is that you've got to make the case for why you're doing it. So we know people are worried about climate change. We know they don't really understand their own carbon footprints very well. We know that 50% of people don't know their gas boilers produce greenhouse gas emissions. We hear a lot that this is all going to be super easy and don't worry, it's easy being green, all that kind of stuff. I think actually you need more honesty in terms of what's required and why we're doing it and why it's impactful. I think secondly, the point about communicating how this is being done in a fair way is absolutely critically important, and all the public polling data again says that if people feel it's fair, then they're likely to be, you know, more amenable to it. And then the third point is the one that Anna made, which is about co-benefits. You know, reduce car use. You don't have to stop using cars, but reducing it a bit means more livable communities, lower air pollution, lower accidents, less time wasted in congestion, etc., etc. And I think, but if you articulate that as a package, then I think there is a quite a strong political story that you can tell around all of this.
That's kind of an optimistic note to end on. So that's good. So we're slightly over time. Let me wrap up and say a huge thank you to all three of you for excellent discussions. I really enjoyed all of it, and thank you to everyone watching for joining us, and do keep joining us for our events. But for now, thank you very much, everyone.